Welcome to the FNO InsureTech podcast, a place where movers and shakers from all points within the insurance ecosystem gather and discuss all things InsureTech. We talk about how technology and innovation are affecting and driving change in the industry. Here are your hosts, Lee Boyd and Rob Beller.
Hey, podcast world, welcome to another exciting, thrilling, enthralling, educational.
Hot.
Here we go with the jokes. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a fire guy on today.
We do.
And Lee has been trying to come up with jokes about, like, we have a hot topic.
Yeah, we have a hot topic. It's a sizzling discussion today.
We have a burning desire to share it with you.
This guy's on fire. Ooh, that might be over the line.
We have somebody with us today who is the fire doctor.
Yeah, Dr. Matt.
Dr. Matt, the fire doctor. Matt Hinds-Aldrich, Senior Risk Strategy Lead.
Big title.
At American Association of Insurance Services, AAIS, of whom Alacrity, our humble employer, is a member. And in working with AAIS, we floated the idea of having Matt join us, and he's here today to share what it is he does.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a great conversation. We're going to get to talk about what he does at the association, but he brings this wealth of knowledge to the association all about fire. I mean, he's trained in it. He actually got a PhD associated with it. He's been around it his whole career, and he gets to talk about how the data that they collect helps set the price for policies. So I'm excited to talk to him, not only about the fire, but about the association as well.
Right. And so without further ado, let's go to our interview with Matt Hinds-Aldrich, Senior Strategy Lead at AAIS. Hey, everybody. We are here with our guest. We have him coming to us from the East Coast, from the right coast. I'm on the left coast. Is that right?
Depending on what, well, I'm turned this way, so it's the opposite.
Yeah. Oh, well, it's very confusing. Maybe we'll straighten that out, among other things. We have Matt Hinds-Aldrich, also known as Dr. Matt, also known as Matt.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. From the American Association of Insurance Services, or AAIS, as our special guest today. Welcome to the podcast.
Welcome, Matt.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate the offer and the opportunity to be here.
So now everybody's confused about where you are and where you live. So why don't you tell us where you're coming from today?
Sure. So I live in the Raleigh, North Carolina area, but I've lived here, there, and everywhere. I've only recently moved to the Research Triangle. So
the Research Triangle. Why is it called that?
Because there actually is a place called the Research Triangle Park. It's right in between. It's basically smack dab in the middle of Raleigh, Durham, and Chapel Hill. And somebody had the bright idea, I think it was like in the 60s or 70s, and said, well, we have all this land. Why don't we try to encourage the tech sector, the kind of fledgling tech sector at the time, to give them a whole bunch of incentives to come here. And it paid off handsomely and has really transformed this whole region.
And how long have you been there?
Since July.
Okay,
so I've obviously been reading the tourism board.
You've been bulleting all those bulletins.
I'm a font of useless knowledge. So yeah.
Let's jump in and talk about what the heck it is you do, because you do some really interesting stuff. And both Lee and I have a lot of questions about what you do and how you got there. But let's start by telling us what AAIS is, and then tell us about what you do there.
Preface it to say I've been here for 18 months, and it's my first foray into the insurance industry. So I actually find myself explaining to people a lot, because many of my professional network is outside the insurance industry. So I found myself trying to explain what AAIS is quite a bit. And so this is kind of what I've more or less settled on. We're a not-for-profit insurance advisory organization. We're also a national organization that serves the insurance industry. And so we don't actually write insurance. We're not a broker. We're not a reinsurer. And we're not really a traditional InsureTech either. But we serve insurance companies. We're membership organizations. We have somewhere in the neighborhood of 700 insurance companies and carriers that are our members. and they utilize our services and they become members to basically adopt our model forms, which have already been kind of approved we've gone through the whole approval process for the various states. We also gather a tremendous amount of carrier experience data and their kind of premium data. And so we take that information in and report it on their behalf. And we also use that for kind of all of our actuarial stuff. So that's kind of the short version. As I was explaining it to a family member about a year ago, and they didn't have a whole lot of insurance background. And they said, so it's basically like you guys are like an insurance company in a box. I was like, well, that's one way to put it. But yeah, so we're not an agency. We're not a traditional insurance organization. And the thing I think catches a lot of people off guard is they're like, wait, you're not for profit in the insurance industry.
Yeah.
I know some people think that's a bit of an oxymoron, but I think it serves our mission pretty well.
Okay, so you were talking about data. You were talking about that you collect all this data. What are some examples of the data you collect, and how would somebody use it?
Sure. So we have a lot of information about all the exposures that carriers would have. And so we don't have data from every single insurance company, but we do have it from the majority of our members. And so they would share that information with us and sometimes their claims experience data. And so we would use that. Now, the key thing is that almost implicit in your question is kind of like, or I can imagine a whole lot of people would say, ooh, perfect. How do I get access to some of that? And which is a great way of segueing into saying that we can't actually share a lot of that data. We use that to kind of for all of our actuarial analyses. We can come back to this, but there's a big one of the conversations we have quite a bit is around wildfire losses. And it'd be really great, for example, if we could have a lot of data about all these losses, so we could actually help answer some of the big existential questions in the wildfire space. But in the traditional way, there's some limitations. There's a lot of limitations on what we could actually do with that data. So we're developing some new technology, but we'll save that for either later conversation or a whole nother conversation.
You have a interesting job at AAIS, and tell us what that is.
Sure. So as I mentioned, I've only been with AAIS and only in the insurance industry for 18 months. So I come from more of the fire protection space. And so I was brought on to kind of lead a lot of our initiatives and efforts around trying to modernize how we as an insurance organization look at the fire peril. And that fire peril being both kind of structure fires, kind of more, you might think of the more bread and butter fire losses, and also wildfire peril. And so one of the legal functions of an insurance advisory organization is to develop rating approaches for public fire protection. And so we've been working on building a new approach from the ground up. And so I was brought on to help kind of lead that effort. And with that, there's also a lot of, we're trying to build a lot of relationships with and kind of crossover, if you will, between the way the insurance industry looks at the fire problem and the way the fire protection industry looks at the fire problem.
What is the fire protection industry? What do you mean by that?
So I deliberately use that kind of vague term because it's actually...
It worked on me, by the way.
Yeah, perfect. Really, like it's kind of a loose amalgam of a bunch of different frankly, different industries. So they have the fire service, and the fire service itself is a pretty nebulous term as well. So you have local fire departments and municipal fire departments. So like, the fire department and the fire station down the street from wherever you live. And then you also have wildfire specific organizations and agencies and state and federal departments. And so the fire service is kind of a lot of cats that sometimes can be herded in a generally consistent direction, but they kind of all do their own thing. But then the other reason I use that term, fire protection kind of industry, is there's also a huge, obviously, the sprinkler industry and all the work around designing, installing, inspecting, certifying, and what have you, all those sprinklers.
That's huge.
Oh, exactly. It's billions of dollars a year, but it's one of those that the firefighter down the street at the local fire station and the engineer who designed and built the fire protection system in some major warehouse, they're both interested in fire, but they come at it from a very, very different experience and perspective and worldview and everything. So that's why I use that kind of broad term, because there's a lot of different folks in the fire world.
Yeah, that makes total sense. So there within the association, is your job to really help the insurers obtain the right premium for a loss before a fire happens, or is it to help them insure houses that won't catch on fire? What are you really helping insurers with when it comes to the fire?
So it's kind of would be the former. So so I actually worked for an actuary, and I work in our actuarial services group, which is really ironic because I was really good in math up until third grade, and then they start putting letters in it, and it's just been downhill ever since then. But
letters
so I never
exactly.
I never anticipated working for an actuary, but as an aside, actuaries are some really funny people. They have a great sense of humor, which they may not have had a professional reputation for. But I digress. So our role it's basically creating loss cost, which is a very technical term for basically figuring out in a particular, whether it be zip code or territory, what have you, what is the expected amount of loss that could occur for whatever particular peril they're looking at, auto or homeowners or dwelling properties or farms or whatever. And then basically figuring out what is the break-even point? How do you, for an amount of for example, $100 of premium, how much loss would they anticipate? And so that's, again, going back to our whole thing, because we're not actually an insurance company, we do all of this on a break-even basis. Now, insurance companies obviously don't want to break even. They want to, have a little bit of profit margin in there.
Yeah.
But our role is to really figure out across the country for all the various perils, all the various things, how much money do you need to take in premium to basically break even? And then they can put their profit margin in down the road. But
I see.
But that's really our goal. And a big part of that, and where as it relates to fire, is in terms of that kind of actuarial and underwriting process and all the kind of all those complex formulas. What does fire protection look like, and how does that have an impact on losses?
So how do you get into something like this? I mean, walk us through the journey about how you get to be a PhD, more or less, in fire, right? I mean, you're the fire doctor, and I just think that's so interesting how you get a PhD with a focus in fire service culture.
Yeah, sure. So if there is kind of like a guidebook on here's the traditional way of kind of charting a career, I never read it, I can assure you. I definitely kind of I charted my own course, for better for worse, and it followed a lot of tangents, but I think it have brought me to a kind of interesting and kind of eclectic background. So so I in fact wasn't. I mean, as a child, I guess there was probably a phase. I remember having a fire helmet for a while. So I guess there was a phase where I thought about being a firefighter, but that was never really my overarching kind of one career aspiration. If anything, actually, I've kind of extended family in criminal, in policing. And so I kind of, some of the ways thought I might go down that path. But I actually got involved in fire investigation in college and went to a school that had a really good fire investigation program. I'm like, ooh, this is really interesting. I'm like, it's a different type of looking at criminal investigation and scientific investigation. And so kind of that was the kind of direction I was going for a while, and thought I was going to go there. Then I had an opportunity to do two things. One, I had an opportunity very young to teach a collegiate class. I was maybe 3 years older than some of the students. And I was like, oh, I actually really enjoy teaching. And so I kind of caught the bug there. And I also was doing a whole lot of research on the fire problem from a kind of an academic standpoint. And so I kind of kept going academically. So I was a firefighter for a while. I realized that was probably not my.
So you've done it. You've done the work.
I have, yeah. But I also realized very quickly that I was going to be the world's worst rookie And so in the fire service, well, yeah. So the fire service it tends to be pretty hierarchical, and there's there's kind of like a very kind of militaristic command structure, if you will. And those at the bottom do the work. Those at the bottom don't ask questions. Those at the bottom don't actually put any thought into what they were told to do. They just do it. And my joke is that I knew I was going to be the world's worst rookie when they were like, oh, we need to clean the toilets. I'm like, well, there's.
I was waiting for that.
There's a better way we could do this. And I realized very quickly that was not going to be appreciated, and maybe my skill sets would be better utilized elsewhere.
Yeah.
And so while I very much enjoyed being a firefighter at the time, and actually, ironically, just recently got involved with a new fire department.
There you go.
I kind of missed it, actually, to be honest. But yeah, so anyways, I've kind of gone down random paths, and then kind of where I thought I was going to go. And then all of a sudden the door opened and I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Let's go down that direction. And so I have this kind of eclectic background where there's some research, like a fair bit of research, a fair bit of teaching, a fair bit of kind of almost like a consultant for a fire department. I did a job like that for a while. And then I've more recently got into really the data space, and have kind of, it's funny, now I'm referred to as fire data guy, and which is ironic because again, my earlier joke about my math skills.
That's really interests us about the data part.
Yeah.
So much of InsureTech today revolves around data and
Sure.
utilizing and capturing data that maybe hasn't been available before or capturable before, or being able to be analyzed in a particular way that is novel. And
Sure.
so give us a little bit about the data work that you guys are doing and why that's important.
Sure. On your earlier point, the kind of proliferation of kind of InsureTechs have all started with the premise of like, let's try to find really great data sources, then we can figure out ways to better utilize them. And so you kind of come into it with a perspective of like, data is valuable. Let's figure out how to, extract value from that.
Right.
Most of my work has been on the other end of that, which is, so when I worked for example, I worked for Atlanta Fire Rescue for several years. And a lot of the work there was on the front end, the data creation. So we had firefighters who never had any interest and certainly didn't get hired for their data entry skills.
Yeah, I mean, they're firemen. Come on.
Exactly. Although a lot of fire ladies as well.
Fire people.
Exactly.
Fair. Good point.
So really a lot of it was focused on the people actually entering the data had the least to gain out of it. It was frankly just a menial task. And in fact, actually, we had a data analyst that we had hired who had come from the financial sector, and he was getting really, really frustrated with the incessantly bad data, like the data quality issues. And just a little quick story on that is we had all of the new people spend a 24-hour shift in one of the fire stations so they kind of like understand the other part of it. And he came back and he's like, I get it now. He said, I literally watched a guy hold his eyes open at 3:00 in the morning after coming back from a run, and type with one finger, trying to fill out the report while swearing because the computer kept locking up on him.
Oh my gosh.
And he's like, I understand, for one, why they don't care, like why they will just put in a report with complete nonsense sometimes. But so anyways, so there's a lot that I've done a lot of work on trying to figure out how do we get those departments that are creating the data. Now, obviously, that's just one of millions of sources of data, but trying to get them to understand the value creation or the kind of the value life cycle of data. And in some cases, frankly, just to finish that point, is that getting those fire departments to start utilizing their own data. So fire departments ask me all the time, oh, how do I improve my fire data? My answer is always do something with it. They're like, what do you mean? Like, what should we do? I'm like, try to do anything.
Yeah.
I was like, that will answer three major questions. Can you get the data out of the systems you entered it into? 2, is it useful data that's actually relevant to anything you actually are trying to do? And 3, is the data quality actually something that you can rely upon? The answer to most of those 3 is in many cases is no. So that's I've been focused a lot on that end, particularly in the fire space, and now now working on the other end of the life cycle of fire data from the insurance side.
It's interesting to me. And one of the things when we talk about fire today in the news is what's going on in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine. And I mean, it's super typical when you see the news about the Ukraine that you see a fire, a building burning, and you see these fire service people fighting a fire in the middle of a war. It's incredible. Any comments on that or thoughts on that? Are you learning anything from that or deriving any data from that? I mean, the service that those people are showing is amazing, right? Because I know where I would be, a long way away.
Sure. Yeah, no, I have not been thinking about it in the data context. I'm a news junkie if there ever was one. And so the big question mark and the big concern is there's some really significant wildfires in the area of Chernobyl, minor, like if you kind of game it out, minor problems of that wildfires can basically aerosolize all kinds of radioactive material and put it into the atmosphere. So yeah, nothing possible like worry about there. It's definitely a major issue, and there's also a lot of efforts. Specifically speaking of the Ukraine situation, there's a lot of efforts of the fire service kind of banding together and trying to provide resources. Obviously, there's, in some cases, I believe some of their equipment has sustained damage or damage, or they certainly don't have a supply chain to be able to fix things at the moment. And so there's been a lot of, in fact, there was a convoy that started in England and kind of gathered vehicles kind of as they went across of taking surplus old fire trucks and basically bringing them. And I think they kind of got them to some place in Poland and basically staged them there to provide like if your truck gets damaged for whatever reason, there's some other spares around the corner.
Cool.
So, yeah.
That's awesome.
I always hear about how these wildfires, especially in California, are getting so much worse. They're happening so much more. Is that true? Does the data back up that we have more fires, or is it that we just have more houses?
To your last point about do we just have more houses? I do believe that we have more fire. It depends on how far back you look at, for one.
Oh, okay.
And that is part and parcel of the problem. Not to get too far into the wildfire history, one of our big problems is we actually excluded wildfires. And this is one of the key considerations now, is that wildfires have always been a phenomenon in every continent in the world except for Antarctica. And there's a great historian who actually has looked at fire in each of the continents. And he also did a history of Antarctica, the only one that's never had fires. But the point there is that wildfires are normal. Wildfires are necessary. Wildfires are a kind of a key part of the ecosystem. What is not part of this equation, and what has become a part of this equation, is what happens if you plunk a house down in the middle of a place that historically would burn at some sort of regular cadence.
Yeah.
Right.
And so it's becoming well established. It's not even, it used to be presented as kind of like, well, this is a controversial topic. It's not even being presented at that anymore. That it's basically established science that that kind of historical fire regimes where fires would occur frequently, and then they would kind of burn themselves out. And a key part of that was actually that forest, like the tree density was a lot less actually historically. Once we did a really good job of putting out fires, and that really particularly started in the 1930s, we got really good at putting out fires. And in doing so, we created a situation where there was a lot more fuel. And so when a fire does occur, it tends to be far more dramatic and far more devastating, both to like losing property. But the other thing is also becomes far more damaging to the ecosystem. So again, not to get too far into the science of it, but if you have more frequent but smaller fires that come through a forest, the forest can usually rehabilitate itself. It's just, in fact, some of the forest actually require that for their kind of ecology.
There's an ecological system called chaparral, which you are probably familiar with.
Sure.
I grew up in Southern California, and in Southern California is chaparral area, and chaparral needs fire to be healthy and to take care of itself. Of course, nobody living in Southern California needs a fire. And so there's a direct conflict.
Exactly. And so now that I live in North Carolina, the southern pine forest, and also you find the same pine forest in like parts of like New Jersey as well. Their pine cones don't actually open up until they're have been exposed to fire. And so, the ecosystem, fire is a normal part of the ecosystem. Putting houses in is not. Brings where it kind of comes back to, well, we're not going to get rid of houses. We're not going to get rid of people. So how do we live with fire? So there's a whole big debate about bringing back historical fire practices, like bringing back like prescribed burning and more indigenous practices. But obviously, there's a major issue, a NIMBY issue with if my neighbor said, like I'm going to set a big fire in my backyard to get rid of all the brush. I'm like, I'm not sure I'm comfortable with that, because what happens if it goes wrong? And so we kind of just have this like Cold War where he doesn't set a fire in his backyard, I don't set a fire in my backyard, and we and then consequently we have more and more brush. And so that's where this big debate and the big effort is going on in California to how do we really start aggressively dealing with fuel mitigation, fuel treatment. And then the problem and the real opportunity and the real focus is fuel mitigation around where people live.
Sure.
And it's really there was some research that just came out that actually said that the vast majority of fires that burn property don't actually start in the national forest, and the federally managed forest. They typically start in either in kind of around communities or areas in close proximity to where people live. And so that's really because much of the debate has been, we just need to, change our forestry practices. We need to change kind of legislation around logging and all that kind of stuff. But that's an important part of the dialogue, but it's not going to solve the problem.
And it has such a significant effect here in California, where I mentioned that I live, and on our insurance rates.
Oh, absolutely.
It's because, and plus the state government hasn't helped that, because they mandate, I believe, that in order to write in California, to write a homeowner's policy here, you have to offer it broadly. You can't redline out areas where we want this area, we don't want that area because it's a wildfire area. And so, it's expensive issue.
Sure. So I'm going to step slightly around that hand grenade, but I mean, it is insanely political, and at the end of the day, there are a substantial number of homeowners and business owners and what have you that are struggling to find any sort of insurance for their properties. And if you can't get insurance, you can't have a mortgage. And if you're trying to sell a home that can't get insurance on it, the people buying it are not going to be able to get a federally backed mortgage. And so it really so it has dramatic effects, and it is certainly is complex. And obviously there's a lot of nuance to it. And I want to be very careful I enjoy my job, but what I will say is that, it is already at crisis, kind of crisis proportions, and definitely is something that eludes simple solutions. If it was just simply, we'll just do X and we'll solve the problem, we would have long ago done it. It's a multifaceted issue. But to your point, though, the California Department of Insurance and particularly the insurance commissioner has taken a really active role in terms of trying to address the wildfire problem, because there are homeowners who are really in a pinch. They cannot get insurance. There are a lot of other things going on, and there's a lot of regulation in terms of where insurance practices and obviously the term redlining has just a tremendous amount of meaning and historical context. I'm not sure this is the correct use of the word redlining. There is definitely, there has been regulation around non-renewals, and there's been a lot of work that the California Department has done trying to address and taking and trying to ensure that, again, they have an important role to play in terms of balancing how do we make sure that insurers, there is a real concern that insurers could go bankrupt. We've seen this in other perils like hurricane in places like Florida and Louisiana and other places that have been like absolutely decimated by hurricanes. And there's a real so the insurance commission or insurance department has a real important role to play to make sure, for one, that they're financially healthy, but also they're a consumer advocate. And so they have an important role to make sure that, they need to make sure, obviously, that the insurance companies are making enough money to cover their losses. But at the same time, they also need to make sure that that there is access to insurance, because having whole counties or whole zip codes where people cannot get insurance other than the FAIR plan, which is the kind of insurer of last resort, that doesn't serve the interest of the homeowners, doesn't ensure the interest of anybody. And so the are you guys then, and we'll head towards the exits here. Are you guys kind of a bridge or a liaison between DOIs and the carrier world? We do interface directly with those various parties. The term liaison can kind of have multiple meanings, but we do have a important role to play in kind of ensuring that our products and the kind of there's a delicate balance here. But so I know we're wrapping up, and the real key point I wanted to kind of take away with, because I think it's really germane to the kind of the wildfire topic, is that going back to this stuff of how do we reduce the likelihood of a home burning, there's a tremendous amount, and this goes back to what the Department of Insurance in California has been trying to push, and frankly, the legislature, the assembly in California has been doing, is trying to figure out a way to encourage and incentivize mitigation efforts. And the key thing here, and this is the point I really want to hammer home at the end, is that there are a tremendous amount of mitigation efforts that are going on, whether it's being done by local fire departments. In California, you have obviously CAL FIRE, which is a separate entity that also does local fire protection. And then you also have like local homeowners associations, what they call the fire safe councils, Firewise communities. There's just a tremendous amount of effort already going on as we speak, and it's been going on for years. The key part, and also now they have a tremendous amount of funding that just was approved by the California State Assembly. I think it was $1 billion or more for all this mitigation. The key part, though, is that data is not collected in a standardized, uniform way across the industry. And more importantly, none of that data is widely available to insurers. So to your point, so all these homeowners that are struggling with accessing their insurance, and I was just actually in California last week presenting at a fire kind of conference to fire marshals, and I had numerous fire marshals come up during my presentation and afterwards and say, we have homeowners regularly coming up and calling us and saying, your wildfire inspectors were at my property 2 weeks ago. They gave me a clean bill of health. They said, oh, you need to do X, Y, and Z. We did it. They said, yep, looks great. You did a great job. Here's a little, you passed the test. And then a week later, they get a non-renewal from their insurance company. And they're like, what the heck? They're like, we did what you said. And now my insurance company just chose to non-renew me because we're in a kind of a high wildfire area. And part of that is because the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. This is where it all comes full circle. The fire world is doing a lot of this work already. And there's certainly, they can potentially be doing more, but there's already a tremendous amount of effort going on in communities across the country, and particularly in California. But that information is not collected in a standardized, useful, consistent way. And more importantly, it doesn't actually get to the insurance company. So they're just assuming, unless they're told otherwise by their own people, they're assuming that, these are like that all homes are exactly the same and they're all have the similar exposure. And that's, and so they're doing they're kind of, in many cases, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing. And it's really disadvantaging the people who are struggling to get insurance. It's disadvantaging the fire departments who are spending a tremendous amount of budget doing all this work and get it's for nothing. I mean, obviously it's the right thing to do and it's what they should be doing and what they want to be doing, but they're not that. There's no recognition in some cases of that work. And so that's really where I see a great opportunity. And I think that's also in some ways where some of the kind of my various weird eclectic background comes to play, where that is really trying to figure out how do we break down those barriers and how do we get that information in a usable way to the decision makers to help address this problem, which is not going to go away on its own.
Yeah, I think that's great. I mean, your association's out there doing so much for so many people, really helping build this bridge over this gap. I think it's great.
It's so much here and so much to talk about. I mean, it goes on, but I'm glad that you made a point to talk about of the amount of work that is going on, and good luck in corralling it all.
Sure.
And making it vital part of the equation. We really thank you very much for being here today and look forward to seeing you in Raleigh sometime.
Yeah.
We thank you for being with us, and let's have you back sometime soon.
Great. Thanks for the invitation. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Matt.
So our company, Alacrity, recently became members of AAIS, and we're finding our way around it. It's a very interesting organization, and we wanted to have a guest on, and Matt was a great place to start.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, it's a very interesting market that he's in. Fires are something that all insurance is associated with, especially on the property side, right? And
Right.
so it seems like they've brought in somebody with this world of knowledge.
And plus, I mean, truth be told, if I could play with fire all day, that'd be kind of fun.
Yeah. I don't think he actually ever does anything with fire.
You don't think he actually plays with fire?
No,
I bet he does. He didn't. He held out on that part.
He may, but I think I don't think so.
Well, we appreciate having Matt with us today, and we appreciate AAIS a lot for helping us to get him. And we thank all you for being with us. And as Lee Boyd says, every time we're done.
Goodbye, everybody.